Florida jury has reached a verdict in the trial of 3 former Memphis police officers in the death of Tyre Nichols in 2023. The 29-year-old Nichols was brutally beaten during a traffic stop last January. He died from his injuries just a few days later. Prosecutors say the 5 officers involved in the incident did not provide life-saving aid to Nichols. The 3 officers convicted Thursday were found guilty on counts of witness tampering, and 1 was found guilty of civil rights violations, meaning the other 2 were acquitted on that. Neama Rahmani joins me now. He's a former federal prosecutor and president of the West Coast Trial Lawyers. Thanks so much for joining me. What's your response to the verdict, and can you help us understand these charges or these verdicts?
Well, thanks for having me. A surprising verdict, split verdict, but I would say it's essentially a defense verdict. The prosecution here, the Nichols family, has to be very disappointed in some of the not guilty verdicts, particularly on the most serious counts. And I'm happy to go through them, but
Please.
we're talking about 4 counts, the most serious of which are depriving Tyre Nichols of his civil rights, as well as failure to provide medical aid. Those are counts that carry potential life sentences in federal prison. And all 3 former police officers were acquitted of those most serious counts. And I'm happy to go through them. We can start with Tyre Bean. He was found not guilty of depriving Nichols of his civil rights, failure to provide aid, and conspiring to do the same. And conspiracy, of course, is an unlawful agreement with 2 or more people. He was only found guilty of the final count, which is obstruction. That's essentially the cover-up. And even though that carries a potential 20-year sentence in federal prison, it's certainly less serious than the other counts. And Justin Smith, the 3rd officer who's shown there, he was found not guilty of those same 3 counts. Count 1 being the civil rights violation, count 2 being the failure to provide aid, count 3 being the conspiracy. He was also just convicted of 1 count, that 4th count of obstruction, the tampering, and so forth. Haley did receive more of a mixed verdict. He was found not guilty of the civil rights and failure to provide aid counts, but he was found guilty of a lesser included. That's a deprivation of rights, which did result in bodily injury. He was convicted of a conspiracy and of the obstruction charges as well. So he's certainly the most culpable of the 3, according to jurors at least, but still very disappointing when you had 2 of the other officers that pleaded guilty, that testified against these 3. We've all seen the video footage. I mean, one of the most disturbing videos I have ever seen, but apparently the jurors, they bought the defense argument that police officers were dealing with someone that was resisting, that was under the influence of drugs, that they didn't receive the proper training. I'm not saying I agree with the defense's argument, but clearly it did resonate with some of the jurors. And frankly, it just goes to show how difficult it is to convict police officers in this country.
Help me understand that idea that 2 pled guilty. So there were 2. Did they plead to a charge that then these officers ended up being acquitted of?
Yes, and we're talking about officers who are still facing state charges as well. So obviously, there's Ben Crump. You have the family's attorney. I'm sure they're going to be very disappointed with this verdict. But
it's been a long journey for our family.
And in terms of an appeal, I mean, that would seem to be a possibility. Do you think there's any grounds on that, or do you does it kind of go back to your? Go ahead.
Yeah, the government, it's very difficult for them to appeal a not guilty verdict. There's very few circumstances where they can do that. Once the jury has spoken against the government, in this case against the prosecution, they're stuck with that verdict. Now, because of the dual sovereign doctrine, these officers may still face justice in state court. We've seen that in other racially motivated cases. Of course, the victim here was African-American, so were the officers, but we've seen cases like that, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery's killers in Georgia as well. So occasionally the feds and state prosecutors will prosecute cases simultaneously. It doesn't violate double jeopardy because they're dual sovereign. So I think maybe these officers will really face the justice that they deserve in state court where they are facing murder charges.
On that civil rights charge, what would the standard have been that the officers were acquitted so it means the prosecution didn't meet that standard, but in terms of helping us understand why they would have been acquitted, what would the test have been that was necessary to get a conviction, and why do you think they didn't?
Well, it has to be a violation of a clearly established constitutional right. So in this case, it would be Nichols's right to be free from excessive force. And the question here was this someone who was fleeing? Was this someone who was resisting arrest? Did the officers go, outside their training? And there was a lot of discussion of this Scorpion unit there in Memphis, and did the officers act as vigilantes or a gang? And so I think that's something that, whether it was their training or lack thereof, that must have resonated with the jurors, because they apparently didn't find, with at least to two of these officers, that there was any constitutional violation whatsoever. And it was just covering up after the fact. So it is a high burden to prove that violation. And obviously, we know that jurors love police officers in this country, and ultimately prosecutors weren't able to get there.
If you're convicted of covering up, or at least partially covering up, isn't implicit in a cover-up that you think you're guilty of doing something for which you must take actions to cover up? And shouldn't that make it easier for a prosecutor?
Well, that's why I'm smiling, right? We often say the cover-up is worse than the crime. And, I've been prosecuting and handling cases for more than 20 years now. And sometimes you don't really understand these jury verdicts, especially when there's a split verdict. How do jurors believe that there was no constitutional violation, but the officers covered something up? And apparently that's what they came down to here. Now, I don't know, sometimes in that jury deliberation room, there's horse trading going on. Maybe there's folks that aren't willing to convict the police officers, because let's not forget, in this country, you need a unanimous verdict beyond a reasonable doubt if you're the prosecution. Even if you have one holdout juror, that's going to result in a mistrial and a do-over. We have to start over. So sometimes when there's more serious counts, you'll see jurors agree to do not guilty, return not guilty verdicts on the more serious counts, and convict on the lesser counts. So maybe that's what happened here. But I agree with you. Logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're saying there's no constitutional violation, but they covered something up.
Is there any feeling in your mind that maybe that this was a stronger case than it was presented by the prosecutors? In other words, you've mentioned the fact that juries tend to support police officers in these kinds of instances. Could there be fault found in the prosecution in the way they carried out the case?
It's tough to criticize the prosecution in a case where there's so much video evidence. Here you have officers that turned off and removed their body cams, but notwithstanding that, there's that poll camera. And going back to the history of police brutality in this country, I grew up and I remember Rodney King was one of the few times that police officers were prosecuted. Of course, in that case, they were acquitted as well by the state. They were charged by the feds, and even only then, some of those officers were convicted. Others were acquitted. And we've seen more and more, whether it's George Floyd, the influence of video and how it's really changed the game in terms of prosecutions, and how for many, many years in this country, it was almost impossible to convict officers of murder, much less serious charges like manslaughter. But what I thought in this case, because there was so much video evidence, both in terms of the poll camera, in terms of the police officers, those that arrived, I thought this would be a relatively straightforward case for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and jurors would return a pretty quick guilty verdict. But apparently, I and other talking heads and legal analysts were wrong.
Nemo, if you'll hang out with me just for a second, the Nichols family spoke moments ago. Let's listen to what they said, and I might want to ask you about it, depending on what it is. Let's listen.
All of them have been convicted of something, and they're all going to jail. That's how I feel. This has been a long journey for our family. I'm actually in shock right now because I still can't believe all this stuff is going on. But we're happy that they all have been convicted and they have been arrested.
And that's very important, that the jury found all of them in some way participated in a crime, and that Tyre Nichols' death won't go unaccounted for. That is critical. We know that this is the federal case. It's different from the state case, but in the federal court, all 5 of them, 2 pled guilty, 3 of them have been found guilty of charges, and they all as the judge articulated, have been taken into custody. So the family was very relieved that the killers of Tyre Nichols have been taken into custody and have been found guilty. Now you will hear from Attorney Tony Ramanucci before any of the other family members may speak.
Thank you, everybody. Today was monumentous because you had two defendants who pled guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law. They testified in this courtroom. The remaining defendants have all been found guilty of one charge or more: obstruction, conspiracy, deprivation of rights causing bodily injury. This is justice for Tyre. This is a very high burden that this government had in order to prove 12 counts against all of these individuals, and they proved more than half of them.
That's right.
So we are grateful to the federal government. We're grateful to the jury for paying attention, His Honor for a clean trial, and now we look forward to justice. We look forward to the state case, the civil case, because what we know is these officers conspired.
That's right.
They made an agreement.
That's right.
They made an agreement to cause harm, and now they are in jail. They are.
Amen.
You're going to hear from Mr. Wells in just a minute. It's very important that we thank Christian Clark and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice for bringing these charges and zealously prosecuting this case. Now you will hear from Mr. Rodney Wells, the father of Tyre Nichols.
I just want to say for the family that we are all elated. We're all very, very happy that these guys have been put in jail. This is a long time coming.
Yes.
And justice for Tyre. So we're just so very proud that all of them are going to jail today.
Yes.
We cannot wait on the sentencing, so we'll know what their total time will be. But today was a very good day for our family.
Yes.
And now you will hear from Judge Ernestine Doris, who will make a statement for you hear from his uncle.
Today is a day that we, in fact, got justice for Tyre. And
Okay, Neama, thank you for staying with us. First of all, was there anything in there that you heard that struck you, and also the state and civil case that's coming? What's that likely to look like?
So I certainly have respect for the family's attorneys, and I'm not saying they're being disingenuous, but they have to be disappointed, when the officers who pushed the case to trial weren't convicted of any of the civil rights violations, at least two of them, and one of them with the lesser charges. Again, this is a case that jurors found that was just a cover-up. There was no crime committed. Essentially, the officers didn't violate Nichols's rights. They just covered it up after the fact, at least with respect to two of the officers that were acquitted of the counts. Only one violated Nichols's rights. Now, it's not the end of the road. Obviously, there's a civil trial, and really that's murder. And, did they have the right to use that level of force, deadly force? Were they at risk of death or serious bodily injury? That's the standard when you kill someone. Doesn't matter whether you're a law enforcement officer or a civilian. And of course, we know in the civil case that the standard is much lower. It's preponderance of the evidence. Sometimes you don't even need a unanimous jury, and you certainly don't need to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think they're trying to put up a good game face for the family. I'm sure they're disappointed. Again, any conviction is good, but certainly I don't think this is what the prosecution or the family wanted in this case.
Neama Rahmani, thank you so much, former federal prosecutor and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Thanks so much for being with us and helping us through that.